Today we move to day 6 of our case study into fake news. What is news? Or, another way of putting it, the many eyes of Sauron. In this recording we will deal with 3 basic elements. One, news as historical records. So we approach the news from the perspective of an historian, which means we deal with it from Lonergan's functional specialty of history. The second one is the institutional framework within which news is assembled and distributed. What kind of institutions? How do they work? Is there a problem of compatibility? And nobody could know it all. Also, there's quite a variety in institutions. Then finally, we end up with some comments on news agencies themselves. For news agencies require a considerable amount of time, money, personnel, and other resources to bring into being and to function. And there must be some sort of return on investment for doing so. What is it? How does it work? Also, there's the question of mediation. You have the energy mediator within a news organization, which is what drives it. But you also have the control mediator, which is the audience and the audience's feedback. So these are the 3 topics for discussion for today: news as historical records, the institutional framework, and news agencies. The many eyes of Sauron refers to the intentionality behind most of human endeavors and activities. And the intentionality behind news is as much a focused effort on the variety of institutions and individuals within institutions that select out from the vast, almost infinite amount of data or information that is out there and select from it what is of interest to them. So this is, in a sense, our theme of day 6, is to understand that intentionality, to understand the various eyes of Sauron. Our first consideration answers the question of where does the news cycles fit within Lonergan's functional specialties of research, interpretation, history, dialectics, foundations, doctrines, systematics, and communications. Now, in many ways, the news incorporates all of them, in the sense that the meaning is attributed to it and given to it according to the functional specialties. But in the work that we're doing is to try to understand fake news, or to identify fake news, and what this actually might mean at a more theoretical level rather than the common sense use of the term these days. We need to focus on one particular functional specialties that pours out that enables us to concentrate on the key features. So while research and interpretation are incredibly important aspects in all this, the really fundamental endeavor that we're involved in is history, the functional specialty of history. Now, in Lonergan's method in theology, there's basically 3 levels of history that he talks about, or that he discusses. The first is probably the one that would make more sense to anyone interested in fake news, and that is the verification of a particular bit of news. Is it fake? Is it true? Is it deceptive? Does it reflect reality? And so forth. This is, in many ways, a complex function in our society because there are social mores and social constraints and political issues and various other things that will have an impact on what is considered fake and not fake. But from Lonergan's perspective, every bit of, every item, every historical fact becomes a question of verifying. They're verifiable. And the verifying can be done according to different epistemologies, but the one that Lonergan focuses on as the epistemological base for metaphysics is that of critical realism. and critical realism depends upon the experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding, and the transcendental precepts associated with each. So if you want to verify an historical fact, let's say the Shoah or the Holocaust, then first of all you have to have the experience of something being called the Holocaust or the Shoah, whether it be direct or indirect through the news and various other things like that. We have to have an understanding of it, which is to some extent an historical development. But then there's also the question of judgment. So did the Holocaust occur? Yes or no? First of all, so we're dealing specifically with the judgment. Now, what evidence do you need? You can go to first-hand reports of people who have been through the Holocaust. You can go to various German records and Russian records, for that matter of fact, or United States records when they were coming in and clearing up some of the concentration camps, to find photos, reports, various forms of documentation of people's encounter with the reality of the Holocaust. Then it's a question of collecting the evidence, weighing it, what does it mean? But keep in mind that what is being verified is an insight into history that is given the name Holocaust or Shoah. So what does one mean by the Holocaust or Shoah? And it is that meaning that can be verified. So there's two things operative. One is the verification process itself, and the other is the clarification of what exactly is being clarified or verified in that sense. The second kind of history that, in a sense, Lonergan deals with is what we would contemporarily call historical narratives. Spangler, Oswald, various people have all, and we ourselves have a narrative, a story that we tell, a history. Some of it just deals with ourselves, the history of our own development as an individual, the history of our society, the history of our civilization. But these are all broad narratives. And we all, in a sense, are historians in the sense that we provide a narrative continuality that enables us to string different historical facts together into a meaningful story, into a meaningful drama. But notice already that the notion of a drama is already starting to modify or provide a context for the development of news. So when we're dealing with news, a lot of it deals with the history of these narratives. Now the third and part of this is when it comes to individual facts. Individual facts, historical facts, there's a necessary to interpret what an historical fact means. And this interpretation of an historical fact often depends upon the narrative that is being presented. So a lot of the news, contemporary news that comes across through the mass media and various other news agencies, deals not only with historical fact, be it true or not true, which is a real issue these days, but also with the question of what these facts mean within the context of a broader historical narrative. So you get opinions. The opinions of different talking heads, different people that are involved in the news, whatever. And these opinions usually are grounded in some sort of understanding of an historical narrative of something that's going forward, or going backwards, depending on what it is. But in anyone who is involved with perusing the news on a regular basis, it soon becomes evident that there is what Lonergan terms the need for a general theory of history. For example, that of Arnold Toynbee. And for Lonergan, the world process of emergent probability, the notions of progress and decline, of development and regression and so forth, are all features that lay out the beginnings of a general theory of history. Now, This becomes an imperative because when the institutions are presenting the news, each one does so from its own particular worldview. And because of common sense bias, sometimes there's really no overlapping meaning between these different realms. So this is part of the major problem of finding a consistency, a wholeness to it. An internal consistency and wholeness and totality, basically a sound, a unified position is simply not there. So this is one of the major problems of our time. When we think of working in the functional specialty of history, then there's a question of what does it mean to be an authentic historian? And again, authenticity, we go back to Lonergan's cognitive operations of experiencing, understanding, deciding, and judging, or experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding, both in how they condition going up and sublate going down. It's a precursor of the two divisions in the functional specialties. Now, when we talk about the cognitive operations involved in being an historian, we can ask ourselves, is the historian being open to experience? Or is he or she closing down whole avenues that they simply don't want to deal with in terms of human affairs because of an egotism or group bias or common sense bias or some other form of distortion where it may be simply very painful to address certain features of reality? We are not accepting reality as it is a very difficult and somewhat complex thing which we will not get into at this point. But the thing is you can ask yourself as the historian, and this applies to you too as well as the one doing this research in this project into fake news, is are you being open to experience, or are you closing down whole avenues of individual or communal understanding that is simply you're not interested in it, or it simply lies outside what you consider to be true? And this is where epistemology comes in to a great degree. Because if you're an empiricist, the subjective elements of being human, that realm of interiority that leads to the cognitive operations, or leads to the understanding of the cognitive operations and the transcendental precepts associated with them, are not recognized as being real. They're simply subjective. So there's the very elements like that that get carried over into the news that make it at the same time very simple but also a complex endeavor to be involved in. Then there's the question of deciding. What is it that you do? What are the values behind this which is setting up to have you make certain decisions on what to do or what not to do? And this is a fundamental element that we'll get into later on in this presentation when we talk about the pivot point at the very end. And you may notice in phase one we did bring up the notion of a pivot point, and this is where it becomes active within the notion of news. The problem with having multiple narratives is that some of them are more or less compatible, but some of them are in a very deep conflict with each other. And this is where history, working on history, leads to the whole functional specialty of dialectics, which is something we need to be aware of, but not necessarily consumed with at the moment, because at the level of dialectics we're facing the problem that there are narratives that are simply completely incompatible with each other. And to determine which is true or which is truer is impossible because they're simply not in the same realm of meaning, the same level of meaning as each other. The thing is that at dialectics, then these conflicting narratives become an important element in setting people up for conversion. Because the difference between a sound historical narrative and an unsound historical narrative again goes back to the historian's authenticity. Are they being open to experience, intelligent in understanding, reasonable in their judgments, and responsible when it comes to making decisions of what to do or what not to do, particularly when it comes to writing history. The dialectic issue faces these issues of conversion straight on, and they do so by setting up positions and counterpositions. So while positions and counterpositions are not the primary focus of this fake news study at this point in time at least, this is where this type of analysis leads. It leads to the identification of positions as being based on sound authenticity of people, either as individuals or as groups, seeking to follow the transcendental precepts as best as they may. Counterpositions, on the other hand, as we've already talked about, can only be reversed because they're based on such an inauthentic way of living in the world that they have no roots with reality. They're disconnected from it. So the only possibility, if you're caught in that type of situation, is to refute it and to overturn it. It cannot be developed. Our second topic of discussion for today is the institutional framework. Now, one of the assumptions that we're taking is that a lot of news is conditioned by the institutions. True enough, there are individuals, there's people that are interested in politics, there's people interested in theology, there's news sources, and with the web these days, it's an incredible amount of information out there for anybody willing to seek it out. There is a problem of understanding it, interpreting it, putting it into a larger context, but the information is largely there. It's a remarkable period in human history that we're living through. But these bits of news are all filtered through institutions. And institutions are a combination of value. There's something that they value. And then they produce a steady stream of goods of value in the line in which they're doing. So to help understand that, we can go to the work of Laswell in Policy Sciences. This is quite an old work. But on the other hand, his identification of values with specific institutional types is extremely useful when it comes to understanding some of the underlying factors in the news. So very briefly, I'll go through his list. And keep in mind that nobody can cover all of this. At most, people have an interest in one or two, maybe even three areas, but to keep up with all of it is far beyond any human capability at the moment. So to give you an example, this is what Laswell lays out. If your value is power, then the institutions devoted to power are things like the government, law, and political parties. So if you know a news source comes from the government, or comes from law agencies, or comes from political parties, then you know that their primary value is most likely that of power. So then that indicates what you need to pay attention to is how what they're presenting affects the power relationships. Either the justification for power, the rationalizations for having power, the justification of the course of action or the policies that they're doing. But in any way, the fundamental value underneath these institutions is that of power. Now, one, if you're in the university setting, is perhaps familiar to some extent, although I'm not sure whether it applies these days or not, is the value of enlightenment. I suppose you could call it wisdom, but definitely enlightenment. Now, the institutions involved with enlightenment are things like the languages, the things like the mass media. The mass media, technically speaking, is devoted to enlightenment. They're out there to spread the information to enlighten people. Now, whether they do it well or badly, or with deceit or malice, those are the questions that you have to ask yourself. But the fundamental value behind it is enlightenment. Scientific establishments, too, are an institutional arrangements that are devoted towards enlightenment. And one of the problems that we have is that these social scientific establishments are increasingly coming under the power value of government, law, and of political parties. A third value is wealth. Now, the wealth in such institutions as farms, as factories, and of banks. So, and again, if the information comes from banks, or is involved in agriculture or the farming industry, or deals with industrial factories or non-industrial factories for that matter, the fundamental value behind it is that of wealth. And as we've already talked about, there's a distinction between wealth distribution and wealth creation. That's one of the fundamental institutional changes currently going on. Another area of value is that of well-being. And the institutions that Laswell talks about are such things as hospitals and recreational facilities. These type of institutions, or these types of organizations, I suppose you could put it, though hospitals are now institutions, they have protected status from the government at large, and if they threaten to go under, well, the government will step in to do something about it. But the fundamental value there is really the well-being of the individual, to be able to actualize their potential for living fruitful lives. So healthcare, exercising gyms, the YWCA, various other things like that, are all organizations set up to provide a steady stream of well-being for any of those people that participate in them. So again, if the news deals with recreational facilities or hospitals, we know that the underlying value is well-being. Skills. Skills itself, having a skill itself is something of value. And there are different ways, there are different institutions or different organizations that really develop individual skills or allow individuals to actualize their potential for picking up a particular skill. So things like vocational training, or professional schools, or art schools, music schools, for example, or the training like lynda.com, which is one of the larger training sessions on the web now. All these are devoted and have as their underlying value skills, and what they provide is a steady stream of opportunities for people to pick up these skills according to the type of organization or institution that they are. So already you can start to see that it's becoming, we're working out the different ways to understand the news, to in a sense develop a taxonomy of it, so that we can start to identify not only what the institution is behind the news, but also the value associated with it. And I'll very quickly go on to the last three that Laswell talks about, and one is affection. And these are institutions like the family, friendship circles, associations that get together just to enjoy each other. There's respect as another value, and this comes out in social classes and castes. So respect is something that can be assigned as a society, and if you belong to a social caste. So if you're looking for cases in which there's privilege being espoused by the institution, you're looking at the fundamental value of respect or the lack of respect. There's always a negative to all these. And the final one he talks about, and probably most important to us in terms of the higher sublating realm of the transcendental, is rectitude. And the institutions that deal with rectitude as a value are ethical and religious associations. So the great churches, the great religions, are all institutions or organizations or associations that have at their basis this rectitude. So already we can start to see the incredible diversity. So if you start thinking of fake news strictly in terms of political news, already you're blinding yourself to a far wider range of what we can consider news, both real and fake. Also in terms of narrative. And again, we get back to the question of, because of common sense bias, each institution has its own kind of more or less specific worldview, their own culture, and these are not necessarily compatible with other institutions and other organizations following different value bases. because the values are intentionality. If you intend value, that's what you're doing. If you intend affection, then you intend things like family. If you intend wealth, then you intend things like industrial factories and banking systems and so forth. So this is one of the great ways in which we can actually start to understand the institutional framework and how the wide, rich variety of possible values being expressed through these institutions can often be confused with each other and distorted and manipulated in terms of the general population at large. As we already mentioned, there's a problem of compatibility, largely due to common sense bias, which an institution is dedicated to their value. They go about doing it. Self-preservation becomes an important element and may take over the actual value of the institution itself, where it is more important for the individuals to enhance the ability of the organization rather than to provide that steady stream of the valued goods that they are supposed to provide. Finally, in terms of the comprehensibility of it all, as you can start to see, the whole wide range of news far exceeds the capability of any one individual. And this is why this whole phase 1, 2, and 3 is devoted to building a team that can better understand what is considered news and what is fake news and what news means and what is important and what is not important, and have the tools to be able to do this in a reasonably quick and efficient way. It is difficult for us at this part because we're just picking up the tools. So we're going to make a lot of mistakes. We're just beginning to use them. But eventually, hopefully, these attitudes will become so reflexive that they will become part of you, and you can become part of a team as well. And then you have something that is far greater than any individual can ever achieve. So this is something to keep in mind. Our third component is the news agencies themselves. Now the thing is that if you're going to set up a news agency, be it mass media or even a private channel on YouTube or something on Google or any other way of setting up some sort of distribution system for news, for enlightenment, shall we say, it does take a considerable amount of time, money, personnel, and so forth to do this. And this leads to the question of what is the return on investment of those who participate in doing this? Now this may range from very personal, you have a channel on YouTube because you want to personally express your opinions and present them to a wider audience for feedback or for personal satisfaction or just to look good for whatever reason. But when you move into the larger, like the mass media organizations or medias, or like the great internet ones like Facebook or Google, then there's a return on investment becomes a major issue because there's a tension that arises between having to run a business, which is essentially a value of wealth, trying to run an organization that is dedicated to the notion of enlightenment. So this is one of the primary tensions that is involved in the current news and the current news cycles, is a tension between the kind of ideology of a news organization, which is enlightenment, and the reality, the commercial reality of a major network or so forth, which is the return on investment, which is usually these days expressed in terms of money. So there's a tension there that can lead to the creation of news, simply the creation of news or the selection of news simply on the basis of whether it increases the cash flow. Because there is something that, again, we will talk about, is the difference between the energy mediator and the control mediator in the news. But this will come a little bit later in this presentation. News cycles are also, for a large part, unless they deal like history. history magazines and so forth, which deal with some of the longer trends. But for the most part, the news cycles that most people are exposed to have a very short-term memory, which leaves them very susceptible to fads and fantasies. And again, this cross-connects with where the return on investment is. Sometimes you can get a lot of money back just by following a fad or a fantasy. And things like the great Dutch tulip bubble, or the South Seas development bubble. These become fads, they become fantasies because they're disconnected from reality, but from the news cycle point of view, they can provide a great revenue because it grabs people's interest. They're willing to pay for the magazine or to subscribe or to whatever it is, or to even view the YouTube channels, so forth. And all of this enhances them in some way. It's a return on investment. But the news, individual news, is largely suffers from the short-term memory selection, which means to a large extent there's no consistent long-term standards for the news. It's more and more, it's fluid. It depends on the existing social and political atmosphere, particularly as the cultural foundations become split up among a multicultural type of society. One of the results of that is, or one of the cross connections with this, is that news reporters and so forth, or news editors, are largely common sense people. There are people who either grow up in the news business or have been trained in it, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. But they all share this common feature of the practicality of the news. So getting into questions of theological, for example, or philosophical or long-term issues that may be involved, unless the long term is something like catastrophic climate change, in which case it becomes again a common sense thing that enters into the culture and the common cultural language as a way of setting up a particular value. In this case, it seems to be power. But even if the particular element of the news has been selected from this eye of Sauron that's only interested in what is immediately useful, it still indicates an awful lot about what's going on behind the scenes with the different institutions, with the fundamental institutional change, to a deeper strata of what's going on in the world. So these little bits of even fake news are very, very interesting as clues or hints to a deeper understanding of social and political reality and a fundamental institutional change that is currently going on. Now, earlier on we had mentioned mediation. And this is also where it becomes a factor, because the energy mediator for news people or news organizations is really the development of these narratives, is the grabbing the attention things that they think will either sell or people will want to know and so forth. And it raises, there's always an experimental element going on to discover what it is that is going to grab the public's attention and therefore provide a greater return on investment. The control mediator is the audience. Those who go to a site or go to a press or a mass media and consume the news, although consuming is not really the appropriate. It's taking up a personal response to changing conditions at a wider scale that is being presented to them. So in a way, the news provides a way for an individual to move outside of their own local arena of operations and to move into a wider expanse, which can be far more exciting, thrilling, and driving than one's own personal circumstances. So this is a control mediator. So the thing is that if the energy mediators at the news people themselves go beyond what is acceptable, then the audience as a control mediator will cut resources. And probably a good case of these days is the SPCN with the football teams that with players who make multi-million-dollar salaries refusing to stand for the national anthem, and this is having a delirious effect on their business because subscribers are tuning out. Because why would somebody interested in sports be also interested in politics? If they're interested in sports, usually they're not very interested in politics. And there are other things like that too as well. You get a lot of what is called value signaling, particularly in connection with the National Rifle Association in the States, where there's companies that declare themselves as being gun-free, and this value choice again affects the audience, and the audience responds by ignoring them or going to other stores and so forth. So this is part of the dynamic that's behind all this. There's also a quest, because of this, or not because of it, in spite of this or whatever, news has to be meaningful. Now, the question of meaning, I mean, there's semiotics, there's general, Krasavsky's general abstraction system. There's other ways of understanding information that are coming out that are very powerful. But here we're going to simply focus on meaning. And a good introduction to meaning is Chapter 3 in Lonergan's Method in Theology, which specifically deals with the question of meaning. There's a number that I'd like to mention to you, just as, again, something to keep in mind when you're dealing with the news. Because news has or intends meaning. And the meaning that is involved can make a very significant change in how you understand that bit of news. In Chapter 3, in Method, Lonergan talks about, let's say, intersubjectivity. This is a community of feeling and fellow feeling, where psychic conjugation and emotional identification are the key elements. So you can understand that a lot of news is built not simply to report the news, but it's really a device to enable people to feel part of a larger community, and to feel significant within a larger community, dealing with people who share the same feelings that they do. So this has a tendency in the current emerging network of meanings and the web and various other things like that. This has a tendency for like people to gather around together and form a community, an online community. There are problems with this, as is becoming evident. But still, this is part of the function of news, or can be a function of news, which is simply to create a place where people can feel safe, secure in talking about their opinions, because it's shared, their feelings are shared by other people too as well. It is a situation that can easily spread into fads and fantasies and fallacies and mythological realities and so forth, because the concentration into ever smaller units of meaning is part of common sense bias and the fragmentation. So it's a diminishment of what it means to be human, rather than facing the more complex reality of conflicting opinions, conflicting values that are very important in any human development. Another element of the news, which is kind of ignored in some ways, is artistic. The whole notion of a narrative, for example, is not simply a narrative as an idea, as a creation of the mind. It's also a creation of feelings. And it has an artistic sense to it as well, because a really well-crafted narrative has an aesthetic attraction to it that transcends the actual information content of that narrative. So it can be an enrichment, but it also can be a diminishment too as well. It involves a grasping of what is significant, which is really good if you're dealing with reality, and not so good if you're dealing with something that is basically a counterposition and far more mythical and magical than real. And it also provides an invitation. It's an invite. Something that's beautiful is attractive. Something that's disgusting is not attractive. So if you have a beautiful narrative, if you have a beautiful statement, it has an aesthetic quality to itself that's inviting. And this is an aspect of the news that I don't think many people appreciate, but it is still there as a functioning element of the news. There's also the symbolic element of it too as well. And this is perhaps best expressed these days in value signaling, or in something that evokes feelings, an image. Hands up, don't shoot, for example. Whether it's real or imaginary, and it seems that upon historical reflection and verification, it has no reality with truth. Still, as a symbol, it evokes deep feelings, and these feelings can be used by the people who are spreading the news for their own purposes. And in things like that, the purposes are not probably very useful in encouraging human flourishing, shall we say. So there's a symbolic reality to the news that is also very, very important to identify and to become aware of. Another function of the news is linguistic. Common sense, there's in the scientific realm you have different specialized forms of terminology and so forth, a language that is specific to that discipline that enables the practitioners to engage with the material they're engaging with. So physicists deals with energy and matter and other things like that. Chemistry deals with atoms, the association, the connections, interlocking, various other things like that. But in language itself, you have a community in which, not explicitly because it's no longer a scientific language, it's just the common language. And the news cycles, no matter where they are, facilitate the development of a common language, whether that language is good or bad or not. And that's, again, another major element of the news as part of the deeper structure of the news. Because the terms that are used, quite often when you actually sit down and analyze them in detail, you realize there's nothing there. But yet the news is presented in such a way that it appears meaningful without actually being meaningful. So detailed studies is very useful in that way because it helps you to pick out the deeper meaning of a statement that at first sight or at first encounter seems, oh, this is totally reasonable, this makes a lot of sense. But then when you dig it out, you find that it's not true. An example of that would be the current debate over wage differences between the sexes. This is a linguistic artifact, a meme if you want to put it out there, that is true as a narrative. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Men earn a lot more money than women do. But any social psychologist or any sociologist worth their salt will tell you that it is, first of all, a political thing rather than an actual thing that can be verified in any scientific terms. And then when you actually start breaking it down and comparing, you realize that men have a very different set of values and different set of intentions than women do. And this difference between the two lead men to select different career paths, for example, than women. So women may find a need for a better balance between work life and family life and home life and so forth, which would structure them towards being in such disciplines as nursing or even psychiatric care or psychology to some extent. These practitioners tend to be a lot of women, educators also, for example. But these are jobs that allow them a flexible amount of time, that it helps them to balance work with family life and so forth. Men can be very driven. And that very driving, you can have a medical doctor, for example, as a male, who will spend 70 to 80 hours a week working on his profession and gets paid accordingly, while a woman doctor is more content to be part of a health organization and have regular hours between, let's say, 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, after which time they're free. They can go home, they can do other things. So when you account for these types of differences in intentions and professions that people go into and the amount of work that they do for it, child maternity leaves and things like that, the data actually shows that male and female wages are virtually the same. And in fact, in some cases, women earn more than men do when they're balanced, when the whole system is balanced out in that way. So there's the development of a common language so that it helps facilitate people. Let's say, it's one of the wonders that a lot of people in the Western civilization can go to another country and still be more or less understood, because they do have a kind of a common language that's generated from the mass media and from various news cycles that go on. There's also a kind of a technical language that becomes available, unfortunately not systematically and not in a reliable way, because of the common sense element of news. Common sense does not deal with technical terms in the way that a technical institution would. For example, astronomy. There's many things happening in astronomy, or even better in quantum physics, and some of these concepts are being carried over into the common sense world, but they don't necessarily have any meaning there. But they do become technical terms that enable people, or encourage, or whatever, people to make diagnosis and evaluations of situations based on these apparently technical terms, of which they have no background whatsoever in that particular technical realm of meaning. The other element too as well is a literary one. And the common language that's being presented is also a literary form. It is not an elitist form in many ways, although in some cases you could say that it was, but it is more a common person's literary form. So there's the changes that are going on in the notion of literacy itself in the language. There's another element that Lonergan talks about, and that's incarnate meaning. And this becomes important when the news starts to talk about individuals as individuals in the job that they're doing and so forth. Because from Lonergan's perspective, an incarnate meaning is the meaning associated with a person, his way of life, his words, and the deeds, his or her deeds. So one of the things that happens these days in the news is you'll get an image of the kind of the incarnate meaning of someone like Pence or Trump, for example, and this meaning is associated with this person, his way of life, his words, his deeds, but the way in which they're understood can be quite different. So not only do you have incarnate meaning given to different people from others with different objectives or different intentions, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, you also have the meaning that is given by the individual in the things that they do and the things that they say. So disentangling this is another part of the fake news. Finally, just to end it, it's all of this kind of draws importance to the idea that a lot of fake news, or a lot of news in general, is different if it's local. But there are major implications when it becomes global, when it becomes spread out, when it goes mainstream, I suppose you should say. And this difference when it goes mainstream leads to what we were referring to earlier on in this presentation, to an encounter with that pivot point. Because when a news or a news narrative goes mainstream, it really demands some sort of position to be taken. Now, it may advocate one position, may negate another position, there's a whole variety of things going on. But what is important is that for a large number of people, there is now an issue that has become significant and demands some sort of personal response. A good example of this is the original, going back several decades now, of catastrophic climate change or catastrophic global warming. Now, this has become a global issue in the sense that it is now part of the mainstream, this idea that there's going to be massive climate change. It's a bit suspicious because over time it's gone from global warming to catastrophic climate change to anthropocentric climate change, man-made climate change. The changes in terminology all reflect a common sense way of dealing with what is essentially a technical issue, a scientific issue. And this is becoming a problem now because in understanding, for people who understand the scientific things, the scientific aspects of our current ability to understand global weather patterns or global climate, it's really not is sufficient to declare any sort of statement about climate other than climate changes. And even climate changes, if you go back through hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of years, the climate change has always been not catastrophic, but more a swing back and forth that's continually unbalanced, but always centered around a common core element. It's like the difference between having a bowl overturned, so the bowl bottom is sloping up, and you put a marble at the top, and just nudge the marble a little bit, and it's going to go vroom, fall off. That would be catastrophic change. But looking at the historical record, it's almost the other way around. You have a bowl, and then you have your marble at the bottom. The marble is always going back and forth. I mean, it's never still. Climate is never still. It always changes. But what it does is it swings back and forth to one kind of extreme, goes back to the other extreme, does a little modulation over there. But basically, it stays around some sort of central attractor. That's the balance part of it. And in going back over the study of weather changes and climate changes over geological spans of time, it is more the second. There's no real sign of a catastrophic climate change occurring other than those due to being hit by a large meteor strike or having a supervolcano blow up like the one in Siberia or other extraneous elements that impact on the climate but are not derived from the climate itself. The point is that these issues become things that people have to take a stand on. And there's a couple of problems with this. First of all is that already these issues are being predefined or pre-organized by somebody with the intention of putting them out there and making them a major issue. Because somebody benefits and somebody loses. For example, if you want to go if you want to have the greatest amount of power over a society, then the one thing you have to control, or the one thing that if you can get control of it will give you the maximum amount of power, is the power to control the energy flows through a society. So the power to control how energy is produced, how much is produced, where it's produced, how it's distributed, is an incredible social control tool that can bend whole societies in quite different ways. But the problem is that it makes a fundamental distortion, because then the primary value is a value system that has to do with control, political control over resources, and no longer has any sort of scientific or enlightenment element to it. And in fact, in many cases now in the world, you can see that the scientific institutions, those people that deal with climate, understanding the climate, have become politicized to such a large extent that the data they're providing is becoming more and more unreliable. And you're now becoming very suspicious of people engaged in making any sort of proclamations about the climate. In a sense, this political taking over has destroyed a scientific institution, or is in the process of destroying a scientific institution. Made even worse when they start through the study of psychological magazines and so forth, and an initial study is suggesting that over half of the proposed experiments cannot be verified. They're unverifiable. So there are changes going on like that, and the changes that occur because, or largely arising out of this expansion into some institution, some expanding itself into the mainstream way of thinking. So it changes how people perceive themselves, perceive the world, and challenges them to make a position. Now, they may not necessarily know what they're doing, but in many ways this is the effect of what they are actually doing, the net result of it all. Making that to the conscious level is another aspect. In fact, you could kind of consider it an element of what we're doing, because this analysis of fake news goes beyond what is traditionally known as fake news or policy sciences or anything like that, and takes into account a far wider realm of meaning and possible meanings that can be able to put a lot of things into a coherent context that you really were not capable of doing it before. So stand by for next week, day 7. I will let you know. I'll post the notes and get this out within a day or so. So all the best, and I'll see you when I see you. This is Russell signing off.